Today I want to start with a quote from former Senator Mitt Romney when he was speaking about China around about 2012. And he said, "When a predator, unbound by the rules followed by its competitors, is allowed to operate in a free market, that market is no longer truly free." He was referring to China. Welcome to Coercive Capital. We've got a great show for you today. We're exploring the world of critical supply chains and advanced batteries. Why batteries? To help answer this question and much more, I'm joined by my colleague Josh Birenbaum, Deputy Director at the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Josh, as he describes himself, is a recovering lawyer and an expert on anti-corruption and financial integrity. He researches and writes on a broad range of topics related to global financial reform. We've collaborated a lot over the years, including on major work associated with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Josh, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So I'm excited to have you here because we have co-authored a new report, which is launching today. It's entitled Unplugging Beijing, a playbook to reclaim America's advanced battery supply chain. As we write in our report, advanced batteries are indeed the bullets of future wars. So today we're going to talk about why batteries matter, how China has come to dominate the battery supply chain, and what the US and allies can do about it. This work is an outgrowth of our ally shoring initiative at FDD, moving critical supply chains out of authoritarian regimes. And that early work on ally shoring, going back to 2020, is now coming to fruition in interesting ways. We've talked about the ally shoring concept in other segments. We think it's actually a critical component of rethinking what we've described as the near global economy, an economy that is driven by democratic principles, an economy that is driven by free market principles and upheld by rules that are well understood and certainly not circumvented. So let's see how much we can get through in the next 50 minutes or so. We have a lot here, but I want to start with why batteries matter, why they matter for the economy, for security, and for supply chains of the future.
It's an excellent question. It was one of the first questions we asked is what sector do we want to look at here for this report? The U.S. economy and the global economy more generally is deeply dependent on China for a number of key inputs, components, goods, and the supply chain vulnerability of various parts of the economy could have been scrutinized. Transportation, energy, there are a lot of places where we could have looked. But batteries really kind of has it all. It has critical minerals that you're hearing a lot about in the trade discussions. It has technology that began in the United States and was sort of scooped up by China, and using a host of non-market practices, which we discuss in the report, they were able to leverage this supply chain against us. And some of the things that we're seeing now in terms of export controls and restrictions really come down to this central technology. And as you point out, when we started this report, we were in the Biden administration, and the battery was central to what the Biden administration saw as an environmental reworking and a next generation of cars. And that still is true, that those cars form a big part of the battery market. But in the future, batteries are going to have a tremendous applications outside of just vehicles. And we're already seeing that in the defense sector. They're in laptops and cell phones. This is really an everything type technology. And it's one that is critically important to the competitiveness of the U.S. economy going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a complicated supply chain, a situation where the U.S. finds itself in a dependency role across the entire supply chain, from the upstream, the midstream, and to the downstream. And I want to talk a little bit about how we've defined the battery supply chain for this research, because that's an important place to start. So when we talk about the upstream in the battery supply chain, we're talking about the critical minerals and other core inputs into the development of the battery. Okay, so the extraction and processing. When we go to the midstream, we're talking about the components of the battery. So the anodes and the cathodes and the other critical parts that ultimately become assembled into the downstream, which is the final battery tech, which finds its way into lots of applications, as you've mentioned, from EVs to drones to energy grids. So this idea of advanced battery technology becomes a core component of so many systems and technologies and operations and supply chains that are critical to how we function as a society, right? And again, to your point about, we started this conversation talking about EVs. EVs are having their moment and then not having a moment, and who knows where we're going. But this transition to electric batteries is happening. That we know is happening, and we need to understand what the challenges are around that, and how to pull that supply chain into an orbit where we don't face the risk of an economic competitor cutting off components of that system. So let's talk a little bit about the upstream, midstream, and downstream, and how we see the risks in the report. So we talk a lot about the processing chokehold. We talk a lot about minerals being in certain locations, but kind of walk us through that assessment, if you would, Josh.
Absolutely. So there are really two separate issues in the upstream. As you point out, there's the extraction of the minerals, getting them out of the ground, and then there's the processing. With respect to extraction, the good news is these minerals are fairly geographically spread over the world. China certainly doesn't have a head start with respect to where the minerals are. Many of the best locations for lithium, for instance, are in South America. The U.S. has tremendous deposits as well. What China has enabled themselves to do, however, is to really corner the market on ownership and control of various mines. So a tremendous number of mines have been scooped up around the world by China. And in this year, in particular, we actually are seeing China's acquisitions of mines go up to levels that we haven't seen for 5 or 10 years. They also have a massive advantage, however, on the processing side. And that's really where the chokehold becomes very difficult to quickly overcome.
Yeah. And just so our listeners and viewers know, what kinds of minerals are we talking about here?
Sure. Yeah. So most of the battery technology now is lithium based. And so lithium is the number one mineral that's going into the batteries. But key battery minerals also include nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite. And to some extent, there's a cheaper version of batteries that requires an iron and phosphate mix that has many fewer restrictions. And that's the battery technology that China prefers.
Yeah, and we'll dig into that in just a minute. So moving now to the midstream, where we're talking about the anodes and the cathodes and the other critical components. Why do we have a challenge in the midstream, right? It's not just about extracting the critical minerals, getting them processed, getting access to those. It's also about the production of these midstream components.
Absolutely. So the big two components, as you point out, in a battery are an anode and a cathode. Cathode is where most of the cost of a battery comes in. And China really has the market cornered on those components. The materials that go into it, which of course are these minerals that are processed and then put together in very specific ways. China controls 97% of the materials that goes into the anode and more than 90% of what goes into the cathode. So we're really looking at a complete stranglehold around some of these inputs that are going into a battery. And this has trickle-down effects when we're trying to build a downstream market.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the downstream, where we're talking about the final assembly of batteries, this is where we get what I would call a compounded impact on the supply chain. Even if batteries are assembled, for example, in California, it doesn't mean that the midstream components or the critical minerals that drive the midstream are free of Chinese influence. No, in fact, it's just the opposite. So by the time we get to the downstream, it's almost less important where the batteries are assembled at that point, because so much of the risk is already inherent within the broader supply chain.
Absolutely. I mean, the point is that China can turn off the tap at any point down the stream. If they turn off the minerals, if they turn off the processing, if they turn off the components, you can't make the batteries. And as a result, China has a dominant position on batteries. There are South Korean competitors and Japanese competitors, and some efforts at building up a domestic industry in the U.S. But Europe recently tried to build a battery industry under a champion called Northvolt, and that struggled and went into bankruptcy. These are difficult things when you don't control the inputs. And one of the things that we can talk about later is China has a vertical integration across these supply chains where one company will often be involved in every component of the process up to their battery. U.S. companies generally don't have that.
Right, right. Before we get there, because that's a super important part of our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about LFP technology, which is the lithium battery tech that is really gaining the most traction, particularly for EV applications. And we have a case study in the report that lays out what happened with this tech, which, by the way, was developed in the United States and was initially commercialized by a company called A123 Systems. And in the late 2000s, they went through a process of development and initial deployment, but ultimately were unsuccessful in scaling that technology. And what happened after that is a fascinating story, and maybe a bit of a warning in terms of how we think about the protection of our intellectual property going forward.
Absolutely. I think that there are a lot of lessons to learn from A123 and also from what happened with battery technology in general. Like so many technologies that were homegrown, we've lost the edge, and we've lost it in very specific ways, both as a result of American inattention and because of structural difficulties that happen when these two competing systems come in contact with each other. So for LFP batteries, which are one of the two main chemistries of batteries, and it's the cheaper battery, but increasingly the equally competitive one, where you're getting the same amount of range, the number of cycles of batteries, the number of times you can charge it is even greater than the other technology. That technology was invented at the University of Texas by a person who went on to win the Nobel Prize for being a core developer of lithium batteries in general. And it was marketed here. It was actually able to scale to the point that it was being put into vehicles and was having some success. A recall set that back. Some other headwinds pushed their stock price down. And as so often happens in the US, a young juvenile innovator tries to bring a technology that's cutting edge to the market, and the market's not quite ready for it. And as a result, A123 goes into bankruptcy, and Chinese companies comes in and scoops the technology out of bankruptcy for relatively small investment. That technology is now owned in China, and it's being used widely. Now, did that company not invest enough? Did the US government not invest enough? Why was China able to do it? It's not that the Chinese system is better or our system didn't do enough, but these are just incompatible systems where China can put in $230 billion of subsidies to support an EV and battery industry, where the US is putting a couple of $1 billion. That imbalance just creates difficulties in companies like A123.
Yeah, absolutely. And this incompatibility of systems is really a thematic as we look at the non-market practices. And I want to dig into that now as we think about where the U.S. Has opportunity, but also how did we end up in a situation which has really been in development over the last at least 2 decades, almost 3 now. So let's talk about this incompatibility of systems and where we are now. So we outline several of these in the report, and I want to maybe start with the issue of dumping and overproduction, because this is such an important conversation happening right now in terms of trade and tariffs. And part of what the Trump administration is seemingly responding to with respect to China is a massive amount of overproduction of everything, including batteries, right? So we can dig into this example of batteries as to why this is such a problem, not just for us, but for any market economy that is trying to get a foothold in these advanced manufacturing arenas, and finding that it's one structural impediment after the next in terms of getting that foothold.
Yeah, the dynamic really starts with overproduction, and overproduction occurs because of certain structural parts of the Chinese economy, the way that they organize their economic structure. And you and I have talked about this a bunch. It's not that the market system and the non-market system is a good guy and bad guy situation. It's just that when there's a non-market player, a player that doesn't need to worry about profit motive or doesn't need to worry about the valley of death that startups have to worry about in the U.S., it allows them to have certain advantages over market players. That is, Western multinationals with boards of directors and shareholders and concerns that Chinese companies are freed from. So what happens with China is the central state government states their growth figures in advance. And that's really peculiar if you think about it. When you look at US growth, we see what we sold the year before, and then we give a growth number. In China, it's the inverse. You say, this year we will have 5% growth. The last 2 years, that was the target. And that is a dictate that is pushed down to the local level. The local governments then build a package of incentives and structures that guarantee that that number is met, whether it is economically viable to do that in a Western sense or not. So this year, as an example, Chinese analysts are saying that they are on pace to make more than 30 million electric vehicles, even though the entire global demand last year for electric vehicles was 17 million. So they're on pace to double the global demand from last year, according to their figures. Western analysts are a little bit skeptical of those figures, putting the number more at 25 million, still more than all of the EVs sold last year. So why are they making so many? They're not going to be able to sell them at all. And as recent news reports are showing, sometimes they're taking them off the assembly line, immediately marking them as used cars and selling them as used just to count the sale for the local government. And the reason is because you make 5% more than last year, you meet the growth target. And that is why EV companies across the spectrum in China, battery companies, lithium processing companies, are losing money. And it's a process that the US would not be able to sustain. But because of the state-led system, overproduction is incentivized, and that leads to what is often called dumping.
Right. And I want to make the point here that tariffs can be used in a lot of ways, but I think this is one example of where they can actually be used effectively, and where if we had more harmonization around the pushback against this overproduction, particularly with the Europeans, because they're getting a lot of this surplus EV production. They have a larger market for EVs right now. Brazil is getting some of that. There are other countries, right, that are going to absorb this. We're certainly not going to be absorbing it. So tariffs can be really effective in that way, but it's not the only thing that we need to do, because as we talk about in terms of China's non-market practices, they go much deeper. So beyond the overproduction and dumping of product, we have monopolies and price manipulation and IP theft. And all of these things work together, in a sense, to create this structural barrier that becomes impossible for any company to compete against, no matter how good their technology is, even if they're in it for the longer term, because chances are that the folks in Beijing can probably wait out that competition. So I want to talk a little bit more about price manipulation, because this is really a key part of the upstream risk that we talk about in detail in the report. And it has to do with controlling so much of the processing and even a volume of critical minerals that Beijing is able to play with those prices in a way that really wreaks havoc for market participants.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right that these non-market practices all reinforce one another. They're all building towards this bottleneck, this choke point of the industry in general. And it all lends itself towards monopoly power. But going to price manipulation in particular, it's a fascinating story. We looked at two instances where price manipulation was clearly a risk and a vulnerability. So the first one we looked at was in the nickel industry. Nickel is fairly geographically concentrated, and the best high quality nickel that's used in batteries usually comes from Indonesia. Of the processing facilities in Indonesia, 75% of those are Chinese. So the vast bulk of what is being processed in Indonesia is Chinese owned. There is a meeting that happens in 2019 where a range of Chinese companies, including Xinjiang, the largest nickel producer, meets with the president of Indonesia and, according to some sources, encourages the government of Indonesia to impose a ban on the sale of raw nickel out of the country, so that the only players that can process the nickel are the ones that have facilities inside Indonesia, namely Xinjiang and other Chinese companies. So that goes into effect at the same time that some mysterious anonymous buyer purchases a huge volume of nickel off of the London Mercantile Exchange, the London Metals Exchange, which is supposed to be the repository of where you go to get emergency supplies of metals and minerals, and that is intended to sort of flatten out some of the risk of market cornering behavior. Somebody buys what ultimately becomes 100,000 tons of nickel out of the LME, and prices skyrocket. The players that don't have access to processing in Indonesia are really hard hit. And after some time, it seems it comes out that the largest purchaser of those anonymous nickel purchases off of the LME was in fact Xinjiang, the nickel producer that encouraged the ban to begin with. So this sort of market manipulation behavior that you can infer from this behavior is really making prices go up and down at whim. It's not the last time that huge amounts of nickel were taken out of the LME. At some point, Xinjiang purchased so much nickel out of the LME that prices spiked 400% in 3 days. So there's a pattern here, and lithium is a sort of similar vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this, I think, gets to the heart of, this ally shoring question, right, around critical minerals and processing, to be able to reduce the ability for any one player. Today it's China, maybe tomorrow it's going to be somebody else, to control the pricing in a way that really pushes out market competitors. And again, this seems like an area where we could be doing a lot more with allies and partners if we wanted to take our trade agreements to the next level, if we wanted to harmonize the way that we think about extraction and processing and potential to pool demand. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because we're going to talk about that in the recommendations. But there's so many opportunities here to really think through, how to break that chokehold. So some of the other non-market practices that we talk about in the report include monopolies, aggressive use of vertical integration, and IP theft, which of course is a well-known challenge. I wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of aggressive vertical integration and how that's playing out with some of the major companies in China that now go upstream and downstream around batteries in a way that is difficult to replicate.
Yeah, I mean, vertical integration is not a per se non-market practice in the same way that monopolization is. Vertical integration is allowed in the United States in the ways that monopolies nominally are not, but it's very rare, and it's rare because it's not terribly efficient. The most the most efficient market is one where there are lots of players, lots of competition, and where you have specialization to really get the lowest price per component and create efficiencies over of scale over the whole process. But vertical integration gives you tremendous market control and power. And so China's government has enabled a degree of vertical integration and incentivized it in a way that wouldn't make economic sense in the United States. Tesla is probably the closest example of a U.S. Or Western company that really has attempted to build some degree of vertical integration. But in China, it's a whole nother level. So if you look at BYD, who's known primarily as a car manufacturer, and a lot of this technology in the cars is really phone technology, right? You see a lot of the players in the EV market are just glorified tablet makers that are turning the tablet as the center operating system of what becomes a car. But BYD not only makes the car and distributes them through its own distribution network, it also makes the batteries. It's one of the two biggest battery manufacturers in the world. It has its own mines, it extracts its own minerals, it processes its own minerals, it builds the components. So really, from taking lithium out of the ground and processing it to putting it on the container ship and shipping it all over the world, BYD has every element under its control. And what that does is you cannot have the kind of leverage against BYD that BYD has against its competitors, and it creates an unlevel playing field. That's one of the ways in which vertical integration leads to monopolies. But as you pointed out, dumping, and I'd love to circle back to the ways that we're talking about allies. You mentioned allies before, allies and adversaries. Some of China's friends are getting having to face dumping from China as well in ways that are helping Chinese monopolies and hurting their economies.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one of the criticisms, and I think it's a valid one, is the contrast between what we could call U.S. short-termism when we think about addressing some of these industrial challenges versus China's long-term view and long-term industrial planning infrastructure, state-sponsored infrastructure. Is this something that will continue to hamper us? How do you see this? You know, we've been talking a lot about, again, the idea of the near global economy, creating the market rules by which market players can effectively compete across the board. But will we get there without a long-term industrial strategy?
Well, I think that we need industrial industrial strategy elements, right? As our friend Max Meislich has said, we need an industrial policy with American characteristics. We need to really build our version of industrial policy that looks nothing like China, because frankly, China's built a system where the vast number of companies playing are not making money. They're money losers. That's not how economies should function. It's not how we want the global economy to function. So we don't want to match China's number of $230 billion, and we should be pushing back upon any country that is doing that level of massive subsidization to the point that profits don't no longer matter. But it's also true that we are very fickle with companies, and that especially small innovators have a really hard time scaling efficiently. And there are ways in which the government can help that process and smooth out some of those bumps that makes it far too likely that a company like A123 goes into bankruptcy. There
Yeah.
should have been a way that it that company could have survived a downturn in its stock prices in a way that allowed us to retain that technology here in the United States. And the lack of scaling support and innovation pooling and R&D tax write-offs, these things really add up in a way that sometimes we're tying our own hands.
Yeah. So I want to go to another potential approach, which has some drawbacks, I think, and it's about the risk of licensing technology from players like Cattle and others. Let's take the example of the LFP technology, which has essentially become the global standard, or at least the China standard. And because they're manufacturing most of the EVs, LFP tech has really come to the fore. It's a more cost competitive technology, which means that some of the domestic players have in the U.S. have been thinking about whether they need to license that tech, in addition to maybe looking at some alternatives to other battery chemistries that they've been relying on. But licensing tech, is that a way to get out of supply chain dependency? And what are some of the risks associated with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pushback against licensing. I think that Ford talked about licensing LFP technology from Cattle, and there was a lot of political pushback, and that makes some sense because in this country, it feels like that's signing up for a dependency, and to some extent, that's true. But it's also true that this technology is still moving at light speed, and a lot of the things that are licensed today may not be the technology that we'll see in 10 or 20 years. So we're in a very different situation than we are with, say, internal combustion cars, where the technology has been fairly stable for the last 90 years. We're going to see major changes in a way that make these licensing agreements, I think, seem relatively small. That being said, China has leveraged U.S. IP for decades. I mean, we talk about IP theft, and that's certainly a huge concern. Thousands of U.S. companies have accused Chinese companies of IP theft, and there's specific cases of corporate espionage that bear that out. But there's also been a lot of technology that's been shifted over to China by what's called knowledge transfer, where a Chinese company and an American company enter into a joint venture, and some of that technology passes to China in a sort of aggressive way from the Chinese side. But there can be ways in which we can learn as well as teach, and we shouldn't be shy about learning how to make LFP batteries in an efficient way. I also think that, again, LFP batteries are right now a stepping stone to where we're going in the future, and it may be that learning how to make them here enables us to make the next generation where the IP will be American.
Yeah. So I want to shift now to some of the recommendations that we talk about in the report. And we can get into some of the details behind these and how they relate to countering the specific non-market practices that we've touched on, and some others that are detailed in the report. But let's start with the upstream of the supply chain. So we talk about stepping up critical mineral extraction and scaling non-Chinese processing capabilities, both in the U.S. and working with trusted allies and partners. It seems to me that there's some progress on this front, and it probably started over the last couple of years with the Biden administration focus on domestic processing and addressing some of these challenges around mineral extraction. But it's also been jump-started with the Trump administration coming out with a policy on prioritizing domestic mineral extraction, which actually requires us to rethink some of the timeframes around how we do this. But let's dig into that recommendation a little bit more, and some of the concrete things that we talk about, including aspects like permit reform, for example, which are so important to speeding up the process. So, we're not talking about 10 or 15 years to bring critical mineral mining online, but maybe something more like 3 to 5 years, and processing capabilities typically taking 5, 8, 10 years. Moving that to half of that would be a fantastic thing to achieve. But can we get there?
Well, there's a lot we can do, and it's less clear where we'll end up, but we know where we need to start. So, as part of the research and the drafting of this report, we did a lot of work with industry players to sort of see what the impediments really were. We held multiple roundtables with a ton of public and private stakeholders, and really spoke with people across the board on the processing side, on the EV side, on batteries. All of these players sort of shared a similar story. One is that permitting is critically important. Permitting makes projects work better, and no one is asking for permitting to go away. We don't want to build a system like China. One of the reasons that China makes 95% of all the graphite in the world is because the process that they use for it is incredibly harmful to the workers and to the communities. They're dumping toxic chemicals right into lakes and rivers. We don't want to do that in America. And that enables China to have very low cost graphite to put on the global market, but it's not that that's what we want the long-term process to be. So when we're thinking about making this in the US, we need to take steps to build a better technology for that processing and build better systems. But part of that comes from the permitting. That being said, there's a lot of good ways to do permitting better than we're doing it now. We're doing it just about as bad as we can. There's no reason why we need to have so many levels of review on the federal, state, and local level, why we can't have the sharing of approval from one project to the other in a similar area. There's no reason the government couldn't do environmental vetting of certain known reserves in the region before projects even get stood up. So there's a lot that can happen. And part of this is also making sure that there's a venue for community members and for affected stakeholders to challenge a mine, but that happens in a timely fashion, because some of the times what you're seeing is litigation that takes decades. Whereas if everybody comes out and litigates in a single venue at a single time in a rocket docket sort of venue, which is one that is designed to move quickly, we can make these projects better but quicker. And that's something that the U.S. government needs to work on. And one of the things that, to their credit, the Trump administration is prioritizing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to move on to the next set of recommendations around investing in innovation, and specifically around novel battery chemistries. There are some in the industry who said the only way we're going to get out of our dependency on China is to innovate our way to something new. Um, so something new could look like maybe a sodium ion battery, or other chemistry that significantly reduces the upstream dependency on certain kinds of critical minerals. Um, Tell us a little bit more about that challenge and what we need to be thinking about in terms of investing in this area.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many elements of the supply chain that are ripe for innovation. And as I said earlier, this is an area we are seeing leaps and bounds technologically. I mean, it's like we're almost in the era of the huge computer that takes up the whole room still. We're going to see massive leaps going forward. And I would want to highlight three different parts where I would anticipate big jumps. One is the technology for the processing of minerals. So I talked about graphite before. We will and need to come up with better processing intellectual property that's made here in the US, and it innovates new ways of making a cleaner and more efficient processing of these critical minerals. The second is on the chemistries of the batteries themselves. So as you point out, there's sodium ion. So sodium, what you have in table salt, is a lot more plentiful than lithium. It's not as energy dense, but for applications like an electric scooter, it might work really well. So that's one path. There's lithium sulfur, which reduces the cost of cobalt and nickel with a fairly abundant mineral, and has greater energy density itself and has some advantages. There's solid state batteries, which don't change the chemistry, but have a much larger range and are much more stable batteries. And then there are batteries that play with the balance of these things. So cobalt and nickel are expensive minerals, and they're very hard to get. Cobalt is almost exclusively found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is an unstable place where China has a huge chokehold on mine ownership. But some of these batteries reduce the amount of cobalt, the amount of nickel, and increase the amount of manganese, which is much cheaper and much more plentiful. Those sort of things will really matter as things go forward in terms of what's the overall price of these batteries and what's the technology it's going forward. And the last area where I think there's going to be real innovation is on recycling. And recycling gets something of a bad rap. You put your recycling bin out and who knows where those plastics go. For the most part, they just get dumped into the trash. Battery recycling is different. Between 80 and 100% of some of these minerals can get used over and over indefinitely. So if we're talking about cutting China mineral processing out of the supply chain, the way to do that is to build batteries that are designed to be recycled and designed to be reused, because the atoms in these minerals are, they're permanent, and we can take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So earlier we were talking about the price manipulation challenge, and we talked about the nickel example. There are many other examples. One of the recommendations that we dig into, and this was one of the most interesting conversations that I remember from our workshopping and stakeholder engagement, was around this idea of creating a separate American or maybe North American critical minerals exchange, where we would have more control over setting the price floor around these critical inputs. Do you want to dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, price manipulation and the price volatility of these minerals is a huge part of the story. And you're absolutely right that the industry was focused on that for very good reason. If the price is very high, those who control the key inputs have strategic advantages. And we saw that early on with lithium. But even more damaging can be when the price goes way low for an input like lithium, because then new lithium production doesn't come online. And that's what we're seeing now. When you look at some of these mineral producers that want to build extraction facilities and processing facilities in the US, they'll tell you there's no profit to be made because the prices are driven so low, and then they might go high. You might start a mine or start a processing facility, but frequently a processing facility can take a decade to make. And if the price is going up and down, you're not able to go from point A to point B, even though we know that the demand for lithium is going to double, is going to triple in the next X number of years. I mean, the numbers are really clear, and yet the prices are going all over the place in the way you would anticipate. And if I could just back up for a second to tell the lithium story, one of the reasons is that the lithium prices aren't really based on any actual lithium sales. So if you look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or the London Metals Exchange, their prices come from a company called Fastmarket. And Fastmarket reports its prices based on numbers that Chinese producers tell them, not based on actual contracts, because we have no visibility. We have no transparency as to those numbers. We just have reported prices. And so China has the power, we don't know whether they're using it, to set the price as whatever they want. And that moves up the system through Fastmark into these mercantile exchanges, into futures and derivatives. So that capacity to generate market volatility makes it very hard for new players to come into the market. And that's where you need something like a new exchange that isn't relying on these sorts of prices to be able to create some floors on prices and some stability in the pricing of the minerals.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good segue into one more area of recommendations that I wanted to touch on, which is really shining a light of transparency on the supply chains more generally. And we talk about how there are clear connections between the Chinese supply chains around advanced batteries and slave labor coming out of Xinjiang and other areas. We talk about suppressed wages as part of what allows this model to work. And there are, a number of other aspects that really point to the opacity of how these supply chains are working and what the real implications are not only for us and Western manufacturers more generally, but for Chinese workers who are behind a lot of this production cycle. So let's talk a little bit more about transparency and why this is such a critical part of thinking through this playbook to push back against these supply chains.
Yeah, transparency is really central to how we can take this fight back to China. It is, as you and I discuss all the time, it's not a shield for America, it's a sword. It's a way to attack these practices that are deeply harmful for the American economy and the American worker. There are a number of ways in which China leverages its secrecy and its opacity. So to some extent, as you point out, forced labor, suppressed wages, and safety issues, again, going back to graphite, but a number of these minerals are deeply polluting, deeply harmful for communities. And that's one of the reasons that they're so cheap, is because waste is just sort of sloughed off into the sea. I'll point out that that ocean is connected to our oceans. It's not like they have their own ocean that isn't impacting all of us, right? So that cost is a cost we ultimately pay for. But the opacity, the inability for companies to say, "Oh, this is where my lithium comes from," or to take the example of cobalt, this is the mine that my cobalt comes from, because some of those cobalt mines, you have children digging in bare feet in piles that are collapsing all the time. Those sort of practices are happening because of opacity. We shine a light of transparency on those practices, and the cost of the lithium will be corrected, because we are paying too little because the prices are cheating functionally. But there are other ways in which transparency is really important too. So we need to, for instance, in North America, be certain that China isn't circumventing trade restrictions and using the USMCA, our free trade agreement in North America, in ways that are unfair, because they're hiding their facilities under anonymous shell companies or opaque transactions. So transparency always benefits free markets. The more information, the better. And it always harms state-led authoritarian systems. And so when we really unlock transparency, and I am optimistic that we will do that. That is something that's so clearly in our interest. We will eventually do that. When we do that, we're going to give a major boost to American and allied manufacturers, processors, and workers. And it'll really harm the Chinese slave and polluting style of economy.
Yeah, yeah. It's nice when the practices that we need to implement actually align with doing the right thing. We love it when that happens. So again, like really important part of how we're thinking about the playbook. The final piece that I wanted to talk about on the recommendations is that, as we say in the report, allies and partners matter a lot, not only because to some extent, market players share a lot of these challenges of dealing with a non-market actor, like we've described, for the advanced battery supply chain, but also because there are huge opportunities to not only create, for example, buyers clubs or other, unique ways to create scale within systems of mining and processing, for example, but also to have more innovation cycles and deeper co-production. You mentioned North America. We have, of course, a very deep co-production system with Mexico and Canada around automotive tech, and there's no reason why that couldn't be expanded, if that makes sense, in terms of these advanced technologies. Which are coming, even if they're not here with us in full scale in the next couple of years, they are coming. So let's talk a little bit about allies and partners and why this is so critical.
Yeah, that really brings us full circle to the beginning of this conversation. But you're right. We think of China as this behemoth, as this enormous economy, and they're really not. They're the second largest economy, but the U.S. is the first, and our consumer base is massive. Our economic strength is unparalleled, but our strength with our allies in combination is astronomical and undefeatable. So we need to figure out a way to align with other countries, because we are not the only one facing the risks of Chinese dumping and overproduction, IP theft, and non-market practices. Countries around the world are getting harmed by that, and we all share a common interest, not to make America the only player who can defeat China, but a fair global economy where companies from any country can build the next technology that drives the economy forward. And that involves coming up with aligned processes on tariffs and regulation to push back against China's practices. It comes up with it involves having mechanisms for reviewing inbound investment, similar to what we have in CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. We need systems like that in all of our allied countries. We need consistent approaches on what we're doing with pricing and innovation. We need to be pooling resources on research and development, and not thinking of this as that real competitors, let me rephrase that. Real competitors need to work together to build a competitive environment. And all of our allies facing the same set of circumstances and the same risks, all have an incentive to build that competitive environment. And that means pushing back against non-market, non-competitive practices coming out of China.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to see where we land on all of this. For sure, this is a long-term playbook. And I think that's something that we really have to wrap our heads around as Americans as we move into what is really a global resource war, right? That's what we see playing out here in terms of this battery supply chain and what it means for our economic security, for our national security. We really need to start the conversation about how we get to better long-term policy, how we can make that commitment to support the domestic players that need to be part of creating that resilience, and the allies and partners that can create the co-production that should serve us really well as we go forward. The more that we can trade, the more we can co-produce, the less likely we're going to end up in a conflict. I think that's without question. So, Josh, anything else that you want to leave with us before we end today's show?
Well, I think that one thing to remember is that Chinese non-market practices are bad for America and bad for the global economy, but ultimately it's also bad for China. China has a model that you and I have described as parasitic, right? They cannot consume enough domestically because their central government holds too large of a share of their economic power. They need market economies to thrive. They need our consumer economies, but that gives the United States and its allies tremendous power. And we need to be brave enough to use that power, or we're going to be the victim of the parasite rather than the one that plucks it off.
Excellent. Thank you. Those are good thoughts to end today's conversation. For those of you who are interested in reading the entire report, you'll find it at fdd.org. That's fdd.org. If you have questions or comments about today's conversation, I would love to hear from you. You can email me directly at elaine@illicitedge.com. That's elaine@illicitedge.com. And don't forget to visit illicitedge.com for much more on breaking news, analysis, and resources for financial crime professionals. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our amazing guest, Josh Birenbaum. Hope you can come back again and join us on other topics. And we'll see you next time on Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network.